First of all, let me congratulate Vint on the 40th anniversary of the publication of the TCP paper and its it's having been written here at the hotel in Palo Alto. And I appreciate his inviting me to say a few words in his very typical open, inclusive style. I feel like I sort of spent part of my technical upbringing in a very different parallel universe that only occasionally bumped into what became the real universe of TCP, and a lot of that was because of Vint, who made that possible. In the last couple days, I've dug through some of my archives and history and have a few personal comments and a point of view. I'm not sure they're all accurate, but they are my point of view. The first thing I want to say, Vint, is that as much as we love the work that you and Bob did at the Cabana Hotel, for those of you who know your Palo Alto history, yours is not going to be the most important plaque there. I'm sorry. Most people probably here do not remember that 8 years before that, there was a much more important event with 500 screaming girls in the parking lot out front, because the Beatles, those of you who know your Beatles history, they came and performed on the Ed Sullivan Show. They went back home. They didn't tour. They then came to the United States later for their first tour, starting at the Cow Palace in '64. They came back for a second tour at the Cow Palace in '65, and they came back again for the final tour, which ended at Candlestick Park, coincidentally. And when they were here on their second tour and they knew there was going to be a crush of people, and the organizers said, we're not going to have them spend the night in San Francisco after the Cow Palace concerts, we're going to drive them down to Palo Alto. And the word leaked out, and there are all sorts of stories. And Vint, apparently, I don't think they cut up the bed sheets that you guys had and sold them in the lobby, which is apparently what happened in front of the Cabana Hotel afterwards. Where on earth do I go from there? So, as I said, sort of a point of view from an alternate universe. And I think of, my kids, of course, when I ask them what the internet is, they tell me it's Snapchat and Instagram. And then one of them said, oh, yeah, Dad, I know about your work. Yeah, it's all really based on the World Wide Web. It's like, well, we still have a lot to talk about here. But, the internet as we know it today, and Vint talked about internetworking and a period of tremendous technical work that preceded it and included the parallel universe that I was in. And I don't think we need carbon-14 dating. I'm going to assert that I can actually do a better job in dating and bounding this period from exactly October 24th, 1972 to January 31st, 1978, a bit over 6 1/3 years. And Vint, you may recognize both those dates because you were there for both of them, and you've already mentioned one of them. And part of what happened in internet work, the way I think of it, is that fields become ripe as technology unfolds, and it's in the air. It's a problem that needs to be solved, and sometimes you can't find the exact moment. But I think we actually have a decent shot at that. This first date, October 24th, 1972, there was a conference being staged in Washington, D.C., the first international conference on computer communication. Very famous in retrospect because it was the first major public demonstration of the ARPANET. But as part of that, there was a subgroup organized as the International Network Working Group with the ungodly acronym INWIG, with representatives from the United States, Canada, the UK, France, Sweden, and elsewhere. At the time, if my notes are correct, there were about 29 nodes on the ARPANET. NPL, the National Physical Laboratory in the UK, had one packet switch connecting multiple nodes. But that was a very important formative meeting, and as I said, Vint was there, and sadly I wasn't, so I can't offer any firsthand work. That effort clearly kicked off an intense period of technological work development, including Vint coming back to Stanford, running an ongoing seminar there through '73, Vint and Bob's work at the hotel in late '73, the draft paper presented in Sussex, which you mentioned at the INWIG meeting in September '73, and then the publication of the paper the following year in May of '74, which is 40 years ago this month. Now, during this period of internetworking, there were these other parallel developments. The work that became known as TCP, which was funded by DARPA, the work of many of the people associated with INWIG, particularly with a focus in Europe and a very complicated piece of history between those, which I won't get into. And then our own work at Xerox, which was sort of an anomaly. Now, a bit of background on the work at Xerox. The research lab had been formed here. Our earliest software had actually been developed on what we now think of as ancient machines. They were really cool at the time, Data General Novas. They were connected by a thing called the Multiprocessor Communications. Ron Crane, is that right? The MCA cable about that big around, parallel cable. But we had developed a model for distributed computing with Alto, high-performance, single-user workstation, mouse, a bitmap display. Bob Metcalf, Dave Boggs, and others had worked on the development of the Ethernet as a high-speed communication system, 50 times or more faster than the ARPANET. And we actually had, people forget about this, a few simple Ethernet-specific protocols. So these are not internetwork protocols. And my own work began in this area when I got drafted in sort of the typical Park style to work on what became known as the Ethernet file transfer protocol, a very simple file transfer protocol just for an Ethernet to send a file to a printer, to back up a file, to initiate a network boot. And Bob Metcalf had implemented it in BCPL, and I got drafted to implement it in Smalltalk. And let me tell you, trying to do device drivers and interrupt handling in a high-level interpretive language, this was a fool's errand. But what I got out of it was I got to start to work on the Ethernet, I got to learn about the networking problems, and we went on to deal with the Ethernet, to the internet. Because it became clear to us that we had all these machines, we had all these networks coming towards us. How are we going to make them connect? Okay, if they're on one Ethernet, okay, we got that to work, and we got the print in, and we got some other cool stuff. We got the Bravo editor, and oh my God, there's going to be a second network. What are we going to do? Well, we need to find a way to interconnect them. Internetworking was clearly in the air. INWIC had started, as I said, in the fall of '72. The TCP effort had begun. But there were at least two issues from our point of view. In general, TCP and INWIC were focused on international internetworking, interconnecting large-scale networks, generally for applications like mail. And so we have the very famous demonstration, Don Nielsen is here, and the SRI van is here, of a terminal link from Rosati's through the packet radio network into the ARPANET in order to read your email. This was not the class of problem we were thinking about. We were thinking about local networks that are 50 to 100 times faster. We're doing paging over the network. We had a slightly different problem set. But the second problem was we needed to have something. We couldn't wait for the committee process, the government process, the TCP effort, or the INWIG effort, or anything else. We just needed to get on with things. And Bob, who had been the most active person in networking, had followed the INWIG work, and he'd attended some of your sessions at Stanford. And Bob, who is more of a pack rat and always has an eye on the future, or the future's view of the past. So I have, from my files, one of Metcalf's, if those of you who know him, his famous bold printed writing, dated 17th of July, 1973, addressed to the INWIG subgroup at Stanford. These are my rough notes on the sorting out of what should be done where as per yesterday's meeting. And he's talking about some obscure debate about segments and messages and something else. But so this is the summer of '73, and Metcalf is part of that, and we're trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? And so to kick things off, Bob wrote a memo called a Proposed Park Universal Packet, or PUP, in March of 1974. Now, this is 18 months after the ICCC INWIG meeting. It's after the TCP draft was circulated, but still before it appeared in the IEEE transactions, and 9 months rather before Vint, Jogan, and Carl Sunshine wrote the detailed specification for the TCP. So a group of people came together at Park, and we said, okay, we're going to try to implement some of this stuff. And we just started in a very quick series of design and implementation cycles. And people like to bitch and moan about big companies, and I certainly have my heartache, and I ultimately left. But I must say, one of the charms of a big organization with a broad research mandate is we could put some people on this, a small, very focused team, where we didn't have a lot of overhead, we didn't have a lot of negotiation. You had a problem, you got together over the coffee pot, somebody had an idea, they went and tried it, and if it didn't work, you got together that night and tried something else. By the way, the heroes on this are really, I think of as Ed Taft and Dave Boggs, who are the guys who really carried most of the water on implementing this. But as a group, and I was able to contribute, I was blessed to do that, we fleshed out a complete layered architecture and an implementation of internetwork protocols with gateways, printers, name servers, time servers, file servers, boot servers, mail servers. We did 4 documented design cycles in 1 year. Within 7 months after that, we had there's a memo from Ed Taft describing how all these servers are up and running and implemented on 10x on a sort of ersatz PDP-10 as our main server. By that time, there were hundreds of machines on dozens of networks of 5 different varieties, and I think this is probably the first operational, real internetworking system that came to fruition. Then so about 1976, I think, Vint, you left Stanford and went to Washington. And in my notes, I show that in May of '77, I went to visit you in your office in Arlington in the tower there. and took you a map of PUP at the time, which Mike Schroeder had built, and you were kind enough to add me to the TCP mailing list. And through the intervention of either Bert Sutherland or Bob Taylor, we had been invited to come participate in the TCP meetings. By then, Jochen had joined us from Stanford, who had been intimately involved and knew a lot about it. And in the product group started development of a second generation of the Ethernet, the 10 megabit version with DEC and Intel. And we started already a second generation of Xerox internetworking protocols, which ultimately became known as XNS, the Xerox Network System. All of that based on what we've done in the first 3 years of working on PUP. And there are infinite war stories here. We also had the 8-bit address problem in PUP, and we had a bunch of issues with that. And as I've said before, the best networking paper that sadly I didn't write is Jochen's paper about 48-bit absolute addresses. God, I wish we had those today. It would address the V4 versus V6 problem. And all of that came against the backdrop. Now, all of that happened at Xerox from 74 to 77 in this 3-year period, and at Vince's invitation, we attended the TCP meetings and we tried to contribute. It was a complex problem. Xerox had not yet figured out whether this was meant to be public domain stuff. Was it a business? No one knew where it was going. In those interactions, we learned a lot. We tried to share what we could. One of the most visible discussions was about the byte stream orientation of the implementations of what we viewed as a monolithic TCP as not being flexible enough, and that we needed to present a raw packet interface for certain other applications. This was a lively discussion back and forth. And this brings me to the second bookend of this period of what I think of as internetworking. The end of it is on January 31st, 1978, 6 1/3 years after the ICCC meeting. It was actually 2 days, January 30th and 31st. It was a meeting run by Vint at ISI in Marina del Rey. And in a series of conversations there and some battles, and there's some wonderful notes on this, and I see Danny Cohen is here. Danny, could you raise your hand? Danny, Dave Reed from MIT, and a bunch of us, for different reasons, were arguing about whether you needed to have an IP layer versus a TP layer and break it out. And after much wrangling, we finally decided at that meeting we were going to do it. And at that point, very quickly, John Postel and others drafted what became known as version 4 of the spec. It's really the first version of a separate IP layer, but it's the version 4 which evolved into what we all live and breathe on today. And as I said, I think that sort of is for me, this period of more general, diverse internetworking begins to come to an end because TCP IP becomes so strong at that point. After much internal wrangling, we finally got Xerox to agree to share with XNS, but it was too little too late. Novell adopted it. By the way, for those of you who use NetWare, you have used the XNS protocols. That's underneath it. But I've described this as Sony getting a design win for the Betamax just before the VHS tsunami swept across the landscape. It was just too late. And so with the support from DARPA and the TCP IP getting embedded in Unix, it just took over the world. And we can argue about all the technical issues, but in some sense, and I'm glad that we did it, but we planted the seeds of our own destruction by making sure that TCP and IP became such a robust, and we were only a couple of people out of hundreds who had done this. You can learn a lot from history. You can't rewrite it. The TCP paper published 40 years ago, I think of it as the predecessor of TCP IP and the foundation for the internet as we know it. A final word about Vint, if I may. He obviously made very important individual technical contributions, including the paper that we celebrate. He also had tremendous organizational skills, the ability to mobilize and energy people to accomplish things, and I will add the patience to this day to sit through endless meetings that I could never do. He could be very open and inclusive. Hey, he let us in from the other universe. In digging through, just to wrap up here, Vince, and I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit, I was digging through some notes that actually several people had emailed on about a decade ago, including Dave Reed from MIT, talking about this meeting with Danny Cohen and myself and you and Steve Crocker and John Postel. And Dave Reed had written a little bit about some of the things that had happened, and then in response to a question from you, he replies, this is Dave, who was a graduate student at MIT. As a young graduate student, this particular meeting was at the core of my interest, so the details are vivid in my memory. It was one of the best groups that I've ever worked with intense argument, but a focus on constructive results. This particular interaction taught me a lot about protocol design and about groups. And as I said, Vint, your technical contributions, but your organizational skills transcend that, and for that, we thank you very much.